We were wounded.
I know.
Much?
You say it's the most. No, I think I can keep it to 20.
Or should be fine, I think. No breaks. Okay. Good afternoon. I think we'll get started. I'm Christian Osterman, the Director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, which of course includes the, at this point, far better known Cold War International History Project. I'll be very brief by way of introduction, just to say information on the Woodrow Wilson Center is available on our website at www.wilsoncenter.org. And for those of you who are interested to go straight to the Cold War Project and its virtual archive and other materials that are online, you can go to CWIHP for Cold War International History Project, CWIHP.org. Very pleased today to host the launch of an important new document edition, document history from solidarity to martial law, the Polish crisis of 1980-81, co-edited by Professor Andrzej Paskowski in Warsaw, Poland. He cannot be here with us today, but we do have with him his co-editor, Malcolm Byrne, to my right, who is the Director of Research and Deputy Director of the National Security Archive over at George Washington University, longtime close partner. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome him here. We're also very fortunate to have with us Douglas McEachen, who has a long distinguished career in government and academia, and I will introduce him in a couple of minutes as well. Let me just say that if you're interested in future events of the Cold War Project and other Wilson Center events, this is especially for those of us who are watching us online via live webcast, feel free to subscribe to the Wilson Center's Center Point newsletter. Most of our events are in the calendar, which the center sends out for free to anybody interested. You can sign up for Center Point on the Wilson Center website. Let me briefly introduce the two speakers then a little bit more in detail. Both of them are longtime partners in what has been a joint exploration of key episodes of Cold War history over the last decade and a half. Malcolm Byrne, as Deputy Director and Director of Research of the National Security Archive, directed for much of the 1990s the archive's Openness in Russia and Eastern Europe project, under whose auspices the research for this documentary volume began in the mid-1990s, initially culminated in a major international critical oral history conference in Jachanka outside of Warsaw in 1997, 10 years ago. And he has, together with Andrzej Paskowski, overseen the collection, translation, edition of further documents that are now being made available in this volume. He is also the director of the U.S.-Iran Relations Project. His other passion is Iran, and he's busily at work in completing a history of the Iran-Contra scandal, which was the subject that he initially started out working on when he began working at the archives in the late 1980s. His publications include the chronology of the Iran-Contra scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal, the declassified history, published in '93. 5 years ago, he co-edited a similar document volume with Csaba Békés and several other Hungarian scholars on the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. 1956 Hungarian Revolution, A History in Documents, and more recently, together with Wojtek Masny, who I've seen here to our right, co-edited a document volume on the Warsaw Pact entitled A Cardboard Castle, ? I believe. He has published widely in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other journals. Started out his career at the Washington Post, and I should add that he is a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS and also taught in Krakow, Poland. With that, let me turn it over to Malcolm. Congratulations on this accomplishment, and you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank all of you for attending. It's nice to see a group of people that is interested in a country that does not begin with the letter I these days, even though I'm also interested in that area of the world. It's also a pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center, where I spent a very happy 3 months this summer, thanks to Sam Wells and others, working on the Iran-Contra book. And I always notice anytime I come to make a presentation of any kind that I'm confronted with an audience that always knows more than I do about the subject. So I'm past being daunted by that kind of thing. I'm just happy to have all you here. I'm sorry that Andrzej Paczkowski cannot be here, but he sends his best wishes, and he is the main moving spirit behind this book, as are our other partners in Central and Eastern Europe, who have provided the intellectual heft and the documentation to populate the previous volumes in this series, which I'll describe just very briefly after I also say thanks to Doug McKecken. It's an honor to have you here commenting, and I appreciate your being here. Later is okay. So just very briefly, I'll talk about the book series, just so you know what's out there, and then get to a quick run-through of the contents of this volume, and then we can go from there. The very first volume, chronologically anyway, in this series was the 1953 East Germany uprising, which was edited by our host, Christian, and was an excellent book that produced a lot of very interesting new facts and documentation. Next, as Christian said, was the 56 Hungarian Revolution volume with Csaba Békés and János Reiner, followed by the 1968 Prague Spring volume, which was edited by a host of eminent Czech and Slovak scholars and former officials, with some significant input by Mark Kramer from Harvard University. Then after that came the Cardboard Castle, with which Wojtek was the main person responsible for, and now the current volume. And each of those volumes, of course, stands alone, but they also together tell, I think, an absolutely fascinating story about the situation in Eastern Europe during the crisis years of the Cold War. Each of the events being, in effect, an axe chop at a dying tree, each one taking a large chunk of the trunk with it, as that tree eventually was made to topple. And our next volumes in this series will document that process, the 1989 collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. So stay tuned. All right, just quickly, I'll go to a few shots of documents and other subjects to help illustrate what this particular volume is about. Assuming that our friend, the computer, will collaborate. Okay. I guess it's a little slow. Well, the first slide is supposed to give just an illustration of what the book looks like, what the structure of the book is like. It consists of 95 documents from a variety of archives, American, Russian, and all throughout Eastern Europe. And the documents are accompanied by what we call head notes. Thank you. You can see that's one of the documents, yeah. So they're numbered, it's got a title. Then comes a head note which provides some context for where the document came from, or what its value is, or what it adds to the story, things like that, which are intended to make the documents a little more accessible, maybe to the general public or to students, for example. And then the documents themselves, they really tell the story, but we also provide, in this case, a fairly lengthy essay on the history of the events for those who are interested. And then we also have a chronology, glossaries, and things of that sort. So that's the structure. As Christian mentioned, 10 years ago we had a fantastic event that Andrzej Paczkowski's Institute hosted, and the National Security Archive and the Cold War Project also helped with, that brought the following people to the table: Yaroslavsky, Kania, Rakowski, Florian Shevitsky, who was the defense minister. I think this thing has a mind of its own. I'm really not touching this. Oh boy. Well, I'll let it go at its own pace. That's Marshal Viktor Kulikov on the left, on the lower side, Commander-in-Chief of the Warsaw Pact Forces, and his essentially sidekick, Anatoly Gribkov. On the Solidarity side, we had Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Onyszkiewicz, so what happens, Geremek, Bujak, Zbigniew Bujak, Marcelewski, and then the elephant who was not in the room was this gentleman on the right, who we met with ahead of time, but who kindly agreed with us that if he showed up, then the story would be all about him, and we wouldn't be able to get to any of the other details that are at least as interesting to many of us. On the American side, had some fairly well-known figures: Zbig Brzezinski and his military aide at the time, Bill Odom, Jan Nowak-Jeziorański, and Richard Pipes. Okay, so now just let me move quickly to the content and the categories that we cover. First, Solidarity. You get, I think, a great insight into some of the activities of the organization and the dynamics, the debates that took place inside with this really is moving on its own. Is there some way to kill the timing of it? Okay, what should I do, the right arrow or the, okay. There are selections such as this, which is a set of meeting minutes of the Krajowa Komisja Porozumiewawcza, the National Coordinating Commission, documents that take you really inside some of these sessions, particularly at critical moments, such as during the Radom meeting in late 1981, and the meeting just before that, which give you a very different sense than you would have gotten if you were reading the Polish press at the time about what was going on. A lot more dynamism and a lot more wider range of discussion than simply the radical "let's overthrow the regime" kind of discussion that was being alleged. Another category, of course, the Polish authorities. Many materials, including, for example, this protocol from December 13th, the day that martial law was declared. This is kind of a collective sigh of relief being spelled out in many pages as all of the fumbling and bumbling and confusion and uncertainty of the past many months resolved itself in what everybody generally considered a remarkably efficient operation that completely turned the tide, at least temporarily, in Poland. The church and its role, fascinating topic. We don't have a lot of internal documents. The church is not subject to the FOIA. I wish it were, but you still get a sense from some of the materials that are there, the correspondence back and forth, and public statements even about the church's unusual role as moral authority and restraining force that was taken advantage of by both Solidarity and the authorities at various points. Stalin derided the small number of divisions the Pope had, but he could certainly draw a crowd, as these pictures show, over 1 million people at Yasna Gora when he went. So they obviously, the authorities took him into account. Martial law. I love this picture. If you notice the little stickers on these militia shields that one person has tried to get off, but not the others. Great insights here, too, into kind of the technical side of martial law. The planning documents, the implementation documents, the orders themselves, a kindly request that that the such and such ministry implement the following orders for operation, X, Y, or Z. The insider account of how a totalitarian society initiates a crackdown. For example, this is not very easy to see, but this is a note from March, at essentially the time when the preparations for martial law were more or less finalized. Probably by September, everything was taken care of, including propaganda campaigns and so on, which were not really in place at this point. But still, you get a sense of how detailed their thinking was and the range of options that they were ready to take into account. For example, this document considers 3 alternative outcomes, the third one being the worst, where there's widespread violence and taking over of different institutions and factories and so on. And at that point, there is a quote that says words to the effect that the use of outside forces is not ruled out. It has obvious implications. The Soviets themselves, for obvious reasons, are also a big focus of this collection. This happens to be a meeting in the Crimea in August, when Kanya is still around. He's in the center, Yaroslavsky on his right, our left, Brezhnev, Gromyko, and Chernenko. And I don't know who those other 2 are, but I'm pretty sure that they are members of the Polish Politburo Commission that was established on August 25th, 1980, probably the likes of Grishin or Rusakov or somebody like that. One small example of kind of pressure that the Soviets wanted to put on, and that you can see in many of these documents. I think we have about 24 Politburo minutes or records of a similar quality. So Brezhnev says, "You state yourselves that you are faced with an extraordinary situation. Why not take extraordinary tough measures?" This is a theme that he pounds into them, as you well know, month after month. An example being this record of a Politburo discussion from early April. On, I think, the 3rd of April, Andropov and Ustinov took Kanya and Yaroslavsky to the proverbial woodshed, which in this case was a train parked in a deserted area near the border in Brest. And I think it's from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., harangued them unceasingly, trying to get them to commit to taking these tough measures that Brezhnev was always talking to them about. But to their credit, in my mind, the Poles withstand the pressure, which was enormous. When you listen to Gribkov tell the story, as he did at this conference and elsewhere, about Yaroslavsky's state of mind at that point and what it took to get him onto that airplane. Remember, he was the defense minister in 1968 when Dubček and others were dragged onto an airplane and flown to Moscow, and God knew whether they were ever going to come back. Well, according to Gribkov, who might not be the most unbiased observer, but he said basically Yaroslavsky was pale, shaking, almost panicking, had to have a couple of shots of vodka to calm himself down before he would accept assurances that he was going to return alive, which he did, of course. This is here just for the first 2 lines of the document, which I think speak volumes about the relationship between the Soviet authorities and the Polish authorities. This is an initiation of a telephone conversation where Brezhnev addresses Yaroslavsky as Wojciech, "Hello, Wojciech," and Yaroslavsky says, "Hello, deeply esteemed, dear Leonid Ilyich." I don't know that you need much more than that to get a sense of the relationship there. A couple of points to go into a little more detail on. One of the big questions, as you know, that remains something of an imponderable on this subject is whether or not the Soviets had it in mind to invade. I think to a man, the Soviets will continue to say that they never did intend to, but others, including Brzezinski, believe that they did, and moreover that the U.S. had a hand in preventing that. Let me just back up. I'm sure you recognize most of these people on the far right. As we're looking at the screen, is Heinz Hoffmann, Yaroslavsky working leftwards, Kulikov, Martin Jur from Czechoslovakia, and then Gribkov. I'm not sure who's behind him. Okay, so just to take this time period, the first time period that is of most interest in this connection, the invasion question, early December 1980. At the beginning of the month, there are indications that surface of unusual troop movements and preparations being made. And this document, which, as you hopefully can see, is a report of the Czechoslovak Army Chief of Staff to their Minister of Defense, indicates that they have gotten a briefing from Chief of the General Staff, Agarkov, providing a little bit of detail about a planned exercise. It's interesting that Agarkov does not go into detail. He more or less compartmentalizes what he tells the different national armed forces, only what he thinks they need to know and not anything more. And at the end, this is only a 2-page document, at the end he ambiguously says that the decision will soon be made whether to go forward with this particular maneuver and what exactly its character will be. But you'll note that the report indicates that there, over a period of 5 or 6 days, there will be movement by 4 to 5 divisions of Soviet Army troops, 4 divisions of the Polish Army, 2 tank divisions of the Czech Army, and 1 division from the GDR. This becomes important later because Stansfield Turner and others at the CIA believed that as many as 30 divisions would be needed for an outright invasion, which is not the number that they're speaking of here. Well, the activity that was happening was picked up pretty quickly by the CIA. The CIA had been covering this issue pretty much from the outset, not surprisingly. And we have a number of examples of this kind of document, an alert memorandum from the same date, December 3rd, that starts off, there are indications that the Soviets are increasing preparations for an invasion of Poland. Recent military activities in and around Poland are highly unusual or unprecedented for this time of year. They stop a little bit short of saying that there will be an invasion, but they say basically watch out. Now, these materials, I just want to give some credit to Doug for his work in helping to get them declassified. They're critical in understanding how our intelligence agencies understood the issues and then at least beginning to answer the question of how that material was used by decision makers. But it was Doug and I believe also Tom Troy to some extent who helped to get these loose. So those are much appreciated. Okay, but this is the main source that everybody knows about for information, particularly at this time of the crisis. Ryszard Kuklinski, I don't think I need to go into any details about who he was for this audience. As you can see from here, he was a colonel back in the late 70s, early 80s in the Polish General Staff, who worked obviously closely with Soviet authorities and Polish, was privy to, it seems like, virtually every Polish military secret, and of course passed them on in great numbers to the CIA for over a decade. That later on, when his case was finally disposed of, which took somewhere close to 2 decades, he got his fame, which in some cases was positive and in other cases was pretty negative. As you can see from this, he paid a high price for what he did. And incidentally, I think I recognize these guys with the guns. Our conference in '97 came just after his case was finally dismissed. And the presence of Yaroslavsky, whose case had not been disposed of at that point, and other former high officials made it necessary for the organizers to bring some bodyguards to the scene. Okay, so here's one of the documents that Kuklinski made available in, I think it was '94, as part of his effort to resurrect his image in Poland. This was a document that I have as a date December 4th, 1980. It's right around there, and it's one of many, many reports that he sent in to the CIA, but it's an extraordinary one if you put yourself in the shoes of analysts and decision makers in Washington. When you read something like this from the person who has been called the second best spy ever for the United States after Penkovsky. A couple of highlights. Here he says, at a meeting with the General Staff of the USSR Armed Forces in accordance with orders from the Defense Ministry, General Hupolovsky and Colonel Puchawa endorsed a plan to admit into Poland, under the pretext of maneuvers, the Soviet Army, the National People's Army of the GDR, and the Czechoslovak Army. A state of readiness to cross the Polish borders was set for 8 December. The document that I showed you before, the Czech document that talks about Agarkov's briefing, is one where Hupolovsky and Puchawa, where they were part of that process. It's interesting to compare what details Kuklinski provides versus what was in that briefing. And Kuklinski is getting his information from these guys as they come back to Warsaw, shaking their heads and trying to figure out what this is all about. But this is about as precise, I think, as you could hope to get in terms of an inside warning of the nightmare scenario that the U.S. Feared for years and years, and that they had always set their sights on, not martial law, but an invasion. And then towards the end, he seems to be fairly emotional in some of his messages, which I think adds a lot of texture to the story. But here he makes a comment saying, I very much regret to say that although everyone who has seen the plans, a very restricted group of people, is very depressed and crestfallen, no one even is contemplating putting up active resistance against the Warsaw Pact action. And this is an interesting point because you can compare this document with some of the American documents that are in the collection, where the CIA and INR, the State Department, for example, seem to have a pretty different idea about this. They seem to think that the Poles are united leadership and population in their opposition to any kind of Soviet move, and they believe that they will strike back, with everything they have to prevent this. And that's not exactly the picture you get here, nor is it the picture you get from the Polish materials. So what this did, of course, was to set off major alarm bells at the White House. This is an example of a summary of an NSC meeting and a Special Coordination Committee meeting. I've only included a couple pages here, but it has the president summarizing the discussion by saying that we do not know whether the Soviets are going to go in. Our first goal was to keep them out. Secondly, we didn't know how they would go in, whether under the guise of maneuvers or by means of a full-scale invasion. Thirdly, the Poles would probably resist again. Well, as you know, nothing happened. On December 5th, a meeting much like this one took place in Moscow, a meeting of the top leadership of the Warsaw Pact, including on the left Ceausescu, Kadar, Yaroslavsky, and then on the far right Honecker. Unfortunately, this is the only picture I could find that got this point across, because the gentleman with his back to us is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was not a major figure at the 1980 meeting. This is actually from 1986, but I think you get the point. At that meeting, as I'm sure you know, the Soviets, much as they went against the pressure of the East Germans, the Bulgarians, and the Czechs, decided to give Kanya another shot. Kanya apparently was quite persuasive in arguing to Brezhnev that the cause of socialism would be set back dramatically if the Soviets came in, as he's memorably quoted words to the effect that angels themselves, if they came into Poland, would bring bloodshed. So it was a stern warning in its way, and the Soviets decided to give him another shot. And it raises the question again of whether the Russians ever meant to attack, or if they did, what was it that changed their minds? And again, in the accounts of Brzezinski and others, there's a strong feeling that U.S. pressure, which began as soon as those maneuvers were spotted and took the form of letters to allies, hotline message to Brezhnev, and public statements, they believe that that was what did it. My sense is that the Soviets may have taken that into account. I'm sure they did, but they had other reasons at work, which we can get into if you want. And I think the timing of it is also maybe doesn't quite jibe with the account of the others. Well, another big question, of course, is where does Yaroslavsky fit in this story? Is he the patriot or the traitor? And I think you all know a lot of the details there. He who was responsible for scenes of this type, and the detention of Solidarity leaders like Kuron in the middle, and Onishkevich, his Solidarity shirt, and Yaroslavsky and Vujek and Gviazda and Michnik. Here you get into some of the documentary evidence, which, as our colleague Mark Kramer once said, as he was in the throes of trying to pull together the evidence, he said at one point that he has found conclusive evidence to prove both sides of the case. And that's pretty much where I think things stand. This is a document that you may be familiar with, December 10th, 81 Politburo session, where the likes of Andropov and Gromyko and Ustinov in very clear, direct language say there's no way we can go into Poland. We cannot do this. It's just too costly. That not only contradicts everything that I was ever taught about the value of Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union in college, but it also goes against some of their earlier statements. For instance, Gromyko, early in the crisis, in one of these similar documents, says we cannot lose Poland, we must save it at all costs. Well, he changes his mind apparently over time. So some of these statements are very direct. Possibly none more so than this one. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. This was, I would say, without doubt, the best document to come out of that 1997 conference, which was brought by an adjutant to Marshal Kulikov. I had the great pleasure and honor to meet with Kulikov in Moscow to ask him if he wanted to come to this event beforehand. And he basically said, sure, but I need to bring my adjutant with me. And since we were operating on a zero budget, I felt the strength of will to contradict him and to say, I don't know that that's going to work. And he said, well, he's important because he followed me around for all the time that I was in Warsaw. He was my note taker. Oh, did he keep his notes by any chance? Well, sure, he's got a diary. Well, then it didn't take long to come to an agreement that if he would bring his diary with him, then he would be more than welcome. And he did, and paid for it by means of the likes of Mark Kramer and Jim Hirschberg and others who tackled him and grabbed the diary and made some copies and published them in the Cold War Bulletin, and got this part of the story out. But just to go through the details, it's hard to read this. All right, it's supposed to skip over to the side, but anyway, these are translations of the key passages, which are up on the top right, and then reading down the numbered bullet points there. I just came from Comrade Aristov, who in a very confidential way informed me of the following. Number one, per instructions, called Yaroslavsky and Milevsky and raised the following issues. We are asking someone from the party leadership to come here. Who will that be and when? So this is obviously Yaroslavsky trying to get some answers. And this is, by the way, December 11th, 1981, 2 days before martial law. His second point, make a statement in our support. Aristov, the ambassador, is convinced that a request was sent to the center. Number three, can we count on assistance along military lines from the USSR concerning additional introduction of troops? This is obviously the heart of the historical question of what was Yaroslavsky up to? Was he trying to save Poland from invasion? Doesn't necessarily sound like it from that statement. Number four, what measures for rendering economic assistance to Poland are planned on the part of the USSR? Then it says Ristov, Rusakov, and then below Rusakov's answers, which are to question number one, no one will come. no one from the leadership is going to come to Poland. Number two, measures will be taken. Sounds like mistakes were made. But number three, crucial, we will not introduce troops. Russian войска вводить не будем. Number four, Baibakov, who's the Gosplan chief, is preparing an answer. And then you can see on the left-hand side the lines that are written vertically. Those translate, these are Yaroslavsky's words according to Anoshkin, the adjutant who wrote them. This is terrible news for us. For a year and a half, people have been rambling on about the introduction of troops, and now that has all vanished, Atpala. Where does this put Yaroslavsky? Well, it's of course the question that historians and Poles are asking. What does this mean for Yaroslavsky? And I will cut this off right now, but it will be food for thought, hopefully. But my sense is that as clear as this seems to be, it really only raises the question of, even if Yaroslavsky did want troops to come, why did he want them to come? Did he want them to take the lead like the Valkyrie and just crush the opposition? Or did he want them in the background in case things got out of control with the Polish authorities' effort? And was it really to save bloodshed rather than something more nefarious? So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. We should say something about how you can get a copy of the book.
Yes. We were not able to arrange with the publisher, who was in Budapest, after all, to get copies here on time. But if you will go to your websites, or if you want to just contact me, you can. But CEU Press, Central European University Press, so that's one word, CEU Press, at ceu.hu for Hungary. And that will take you to a sales and information page. And there is a gentleman named Martin Greenwald, whose email is there. And Martin has promised that anyone who sends him an email with their credit card information will get the volume for 20% off. So that's your incentive.
Very good. Thank you. Let me just underline that the 95 documents in this volume are really the cream of the crop of a really large crop of documents, dozens, hundreds of documents that an international team centered at the National Security Archive and the Cold War Project, but involving scholars from Warsaw, Bulgaria, East Germany, Czech Republic, a host of other countries, and Moscow, of course, and that these documents can be and probably should be seen in the context of this larger set of materials, some of which are also accessible on the website of the National Security Archive and the Cold War Project. As Malcolm mentioned, some of the documents have in fact in the past been published in the Cold War Project bulletin available here from the center.
You can also visit the National Security Archive anytime and look at all of those documents.
That's right there. Copies in the collection there. Now, we're very fortunate to have as a commentator today with us Doug McEachen, who was not only there at the time and has a unique contemporary perspective on these events, but also has done a lot of very thoughtful reflecting about the crisis and the events and its legacy since then. Doug is currently engaged in lessons learned studies for the CIA's Center for the Study of Intelligence, and he also serves as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on bioterrorist threats. He is also an associate professor at Georgetown University, co-chairing a MacArthur Foundation-funded project studying the roots of strategic surprise in U.S. national security policy. From March 2003 to August 2004, he headed an investigative team for the 9/11 Commission. He retired in 1995 from the CIA after a 30-year career in which his last position was Deputy Director for Intelligence. And he then joined Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School as a senior research fellow. Most of his career at CIA was devoted to analysis of Soviet and Warsaw Pact military forces, and much of this time was spent supporting arms control policy. From the mid-70s through 1978, he was the intelligence advisor to the U.S. delegation at the Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction negotiations in Europe. From March 89 to March 1993, he was the DCI representative on the Washington Interagency Arms Control Coordinating Group. Perhaps somewhat more relevant to this discussion today, his assignments also included a position as the chief of strategic warning, chief of the strategic warning staff at the Pentagon from 79 to 1980. From 81 to 1984, he was the deputy director and the director of the CIA office that ran the agency's 24-hour operations center and prepared the President's Daily Brief and National Intelligence Daily. Finally, from mid-1984 to March 1989, he served as the director of the CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis. Prior to that, he served as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps and was also a faculty member in economics at Miami University of Ohio. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you back, Doug. You've got the floor.
Well, the first thing I'm going to have to do is throw out all my talking points because I have to deal with all the points that Malcolm raised here. But one thing, a couple of things points I had planned to make, and I like to make right up front before we get to some of the who shot whom on this, because I can give you some details on what we saw from this side. But the value of doing this. Now, I realize that history is a virtual obscenity in Washington now. We don't look at history. Last week is about as far as we can go. Although I think that there are some books on some countries that begin with I, where you should go down here to the bookstore and it has History for Dummies and get it. And you might save yourself a lot of trouble. But the reason one of the things that has always jumped out at me, and I was personally involved in a number of cases, starting in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and then the Yom Kippur War, where at least Henry Kissinger did finally confess to his mindset, to the 1989 invasion of Afghanistan. I was at the warning staff, and then this one, and the frustrations, and looking at the ability of brilliant, well-educated, top-ranking officials to go into an absolute blind state of denial, led, and along with many intelligence analysts, led me at a recent conference, or not so recent, up at Princeton, when some esteemed Cold War scholar pointed out that the job of intelligence was to divine the intentions of the Soviets at that time. My answer was yes, and as soon as we figure them out, send them a telegram and tell them what they are, because one thing you will clearly see when you read this, and if you read all the others, is everything is a work in progress. And people who think that your job is to predict what they will do when they don't know what they're going to do, or are subject to change, is absolutely idiocy, and it's one of the biggest flaws in our policy-making process and our intelligence process, and nobody will address it. So if you read these studies, it really leaps out at you. Now, I happen to have done this book, which I'm sorry to say I can't sell because it's my last one, and on this issue, because I tried to give the picture from our side of this point. And so I'm going to try to just give you a little summation of that, and try to bring up some of the things that we compared to the documents here. I will say you gave the date as the 25th of August, in which the instructions were given to begin the planning for martial law. I think that was the date of your memo there.
That was the setting up of the Politburo Commission.
Yeah, the commission. Mm-hmm. And the person who was assigned to that commission had been very close to us since actually 1974. It wasn't quite a decade. A military officer who had been so outraged that the invasion of Czechoslovakia that he spoke out too loud, was sent back to Warsaw, and never got promoted again, while his colleagues got to be generals. And he happened to be assigned to be the rapporteur for this little group. And so by the 28th of August, we heard about it. I don't know if I'm supposed to, I don't know if I got all these details here, so if I go to jail. But we clearly knew from the beginning that there was a plan underway to make martial law. And I will tell you that on the night of December 13th, I was at a party. I can't remember if I had my second or third martini yet. It was at a good friend's house. When I got a call from the operations center, which is at that time I was ahead, and I was called into the building and arrived, and Director Casey and Deputy Director Gates and various experts on Polish political thought and sociology were sitting about the table arguing as to whether or not this was really martial law, which was happening. And this was, I guess, probably about 5 hours after the roundup in the meeting hall, which is one reason the martial law was so efficient. If you could have designed a way to make it be efficient, say, get all of Solidarity in one big gathering hall so we can round them up with one sweep, and there they went, and it was game over in first quarter. But they're still arguing whether this is really martial law. And finally, one of my colleagues, in our earlier stint, I'd been off the specific Soviet account for about 3 months, I guess, but who knew that the plan called for the announcement to be made at 6 o'clock in the morning. So at about 10 minutes after midnight, our time, he walked over, and in comes a paper clip, press clip, walked in and tossed it on the desk and said, in case anybody's got any questions, they just announced it. But that's how hard the state of denial can set in. So all I'm saying is, let's stop getting into the business of crystal ball gazing and forecasting and doing other stuff. Let's start studying what is the dynamics. And if you go back to mid-'70s and later '70s and see what's all going on, as I say, I'm going to try to take up some of your points here, but one thing is, rather than predict what someone will or won't do, when you read these papers, it's a lesson for anybody in the business of intelligence and policy. Let's see, I've got these vectors all going. Why don't I stick another one into the pot and see if I can affect how these chemistry factors turn out, instead of saying they will or they won't. Because that's what we said in '68, they won't kill détente, even though they had nearly 30 divisions, all mobilized and ready to go for 2 months. Yom Kippur, Kissinger admitted that he just couldn't believe they'd destroy the peace talks he was going to head up a week after Yom Kippur. In Afghanistan, in this case, I think maybe the analysts decided we were all right on our side. They'd never be so stupid as to do what we did in Vietnam, just like we'd never be so stupid as to do what they did in Afghanistan. But after they did it, about 3 months later, we were listening to their messages going home, and we said, well, it was our analysts that got it right. It was those guys that were so stupid that got it wrong. But, we set the thing. Christmas Eve, 1979, people are still sitting out there writing messages to the White House saying, well, I'm not sure this is really an invasion. Okay, that's just my little hobby horse. And then this one. We can go through this one just a little bit, because from our perspective, one thing that happened was, and as always happens, and this affected Brzezinski, because if you recall, we're on a trail. We had the fall of the Shah, which we knew would never happen. And so anytime there's a great catastrophic mistake like that, then you spend the next 10 weeks warning about the war that's going to start each Saturday night. And so, but I always watched, and I think Brzezinski really felt, because he was one person who was definitely hard on the issue on Afghanistan before it happened. And of course, in this case, in 1980, he was hard on this, and he had some emotional connections as well. But in 1980, I'll just assert it, and we can debate it later, but what we saw, and what was threatened as a warning, which caused me to be late to get to the Redskins game because of the meeting that morning, And when I got there, just as 3 congressmen were loudspeakers, Congressman so-and-so, go to so-and-so place, because they were going to outbrief Congress. Well, I'm glad somebody's life was ruined worse than mine. But in the 1980 dust-up, as it were, the issue was basically, if the Soviets were going to do an invasion a la Czechoslovakia, they put 30 divisions into Czechoslovakia, or 28, and that was not as big an armed force as Poland. So if they're going to go in there against the resistance from the Polish military, make it an outright invasion, that's where the 30 divisions came from. And if it wasn't 30, it was a whole lot more than 13. Because the answer to the question, how many divisions does the Pope have, the answer later was 13 Polish divisions. So that was where that calculus all came from. Now, the big uncertainty, and I think I was able to describe that, where there was some bad weather at that time. So you were a little bit uncertain as to what was exactly going on the ground as opposed to blah, blah. But I think that, and we subsequently learned at the meeting in Moscow, the decision was made then, it's not going to be an invasion. And frankly, some of us thought that the invasion was highly overhyped, because if you're going in with that force that was described, you better have the Polish army on your side. You can't go in there roughly 1-to-1. And what Kuklinski was speaking of was the army probably wasn't going to put up a big resistance, but it didn't mean that the people who were in the street weren't going to resist. And if you track this thing from beginning to end, and I would argue for one thing that had a strong influence in shaping the outcome, was whatever else was wrong with Yaroslavsky, and it was even more manifest in Kanya's position. The one thing he didn't want to do was be shooting a lot of Polish workers and students in the street. That was the one thing he didn't want to do. So the thing was basically put on hold. They did do an exercise. The things heated up. I look upon this. A second note was, I just have to. The spring, that Soyuz exercise in the spring was definitely being considered as this will be the way we'll do it. We'll introduce the forces and all that. But as some documents, I think you got them, or some, I can't remember, but they came even from the Germans who met with them. Kulikov was pretty explicit. We'll be glad to come in and help you, but you can't put us in an invasion position. You've got to be the lead in this. And what had happened, if my recollection serves me, I didn't do my homework. No multiple choice quizzes afterwards. My recollection, this is about the time we had that one big incident where they raided the meeting and did beatings and
Bitkosh, yeah.
And so then there was big threats, and Solidarity went into the fortress status. They moved food and cots into all the factories and put out little warning letters and everything else. So if you're going to crack down martial law then, you are going to have to carry out a pretty tough operation. And so with the pressure from the Soviets to do it, but as the documents show, at the same time the Soviets being unwilling to make it an outright invasion, and Kanya and Yaroslavsky clearly being, one thing I don't want to do is shoot a lot of my citizens in the street. 1981 didn't come off. I mean, the April thing didn't come off. But I certainly agree that it wasn't too long after that, and this is where I get back again to, let's just describe what was taking place. If you describe the steps that Solidarity was taking, September, October, and then you look at what happens over here in the party, who's one of the people whose all your documents show was, and all the information we're getting from Richard indicates is not in favor of it, is a guy named Kanya. All of a sudden, guess what? He's gone. So what I'm saying is, if you sit down sometime and simply do a chronology of the events that are taking place and see the dynamic, you don't have to predict it is or isn't going to happen. You certainly can predict that it's a very distinct possibility. So now, getting on a couple of these other as I said, and I wrote my critique because, except for these fat-necked, thin-headed military analysts who didn't have the sophistication to understand the true motives of the political decision makers, everybody was saying this will not happen unless the Soviets mobilize 25 to 30 divisions, because the Poles will never cooperate. Poles won't shoot Poles. That was the axiom. And that drove every political judgment that was made. Like I say, I'm talking from the standpoint of how do you take lessons learned from all of this history and put it to work. So that was just, nobody was accepting it. New administration came in, and I'll be completely honest with you, in their view, Soviet invasion was the preferred, was the outcome, and never martial law. So anybody that tried to say, no, it's going to, so the whole Western perception got locked in, Soviet invasion or nothing. Now, I have to say that all the documents that you've read and I've read will indicate that that Yaroslavsky, Kuklinski was sending his mail in the fall that said it's pretty close to a done deal. In one case, and they somehow, and we all have suspicions who passed the word to the Vatican, and then later it got to the KGB and then to the Polish counterintelligence, that there was a spy somewhere, because they knew, I think in September, that the United States even had the code name for the operation. So they're starting a counterintelligence investigation to find the spy. There's a little benefit there because one of the apartment mates of Kuklinski also happened to be working for Western people, and he defected in September, and Kuklinski was hoping that would take the heat off him. But he said at the time, okay, they're going to probably catch me any time, but I'm going to stay here and do what I can to prevent this thing from happening. So it was his view that it was headed towards that line. Yeah, I think it was in October when he was told, after returning from one of the other capitals, met by a colleague who said the decision has been made, the declarations are being drafted and printed for distribution, and I think they were being printed in Moscow, in fact, as a kind favor, so nobody would know what they were being done. And it's a go. We're just going to have to work out the details. And that was when we had this miracle of Mo Curley and Larry, his trailers, watchers. He was under surveillance by then, as we knew, but stopped to get a beer somewhere, and a courageous colleague got in the car and got him out of there in the middle of the night with his family. I guess 1st or 2nd of November. Point being, as of that time, the United States has every lousy detail, the martial law plan, and the guy who was the main sort of rapporteur, executive assistant, whatever you call him here, facilitator, is out here with all that information. And so we really helped the big excuse that Yaroslavsky used years later. Because Monday morning, everybody here, where's Comrade Richard? Oh, I guess we now know who the spy was, don't we? Oh my God. If you could have recruited one guy from that whole commission, recruit the guy that's keeping the records. And so later he claimed that since the United States never made a single sweep, we gave tacit approval to his lesser of the evil. And that was the excuse he used, and a lot of Americans tended to support it. And a lot of Americans said there's nothing we could have done. Well, wait a minute. If you look back at the record, if somehow we'd have stirred up a fuss, because as we saw, and when Mark Kramer showed me those things, and I was at Harvard with him, it was the happiest day of my life because it proved the theory that, boy, Yaroslavsky was loose, was very nervous right up to the last minute. And oh, by the way, comrades, you are going to give me the military backup I need, and not just military backup, Soviet troops would make him look less bad. What do you mean you're not going to do it? And it wasn't because the U.S. scared him off by then. I hate to point out something to everybody, that 2 years earlier, at almost exactly the same day, they pulled off another invasion with a mere 4 divisions, which, because they knew they would be greeted as liberators when they got there. 2 years later, they are up to their necks in Afghanistan, pouring resources in, and by this time, it's sorry, comrade, we can't afford another to be seen carrying out yet another invasion, and you're on your own. So again, Yaroslavsky had every reason to believe he'd get back up, but by that time, he was on his own. So I think I've hit all the points you raised. The CIA view, yeah, it was blindside, and I always felt terrible after that, because I'll say one last thing. You asked, was Yaroslavsky a hero or not? I was at a meeting in Geneva a few years ago with an international group of military officers, and a Polish officer asked me if Kuklinski was a traitor. And all I could say is, well, what he was not, he didn't think he was betraying his country. He thought he was trying to save his country. And what if, instead of us sitting here and doing nothing, we had gone out on the Thanksgiving weekend and started a public campaign? You think Yaroslavsky? I can't prove it would have stopped it, but it's no excuse, just like there's no excuse in the recent events we've had up in this country, to say, well, it wouldn't have made any difference if we'd have gone public. It wouldn't, you know. Well, did you try? And so nobody tried. And I think if we'd have tried and then it would have called it off, yeah, the Cold War, the wall did come down 9 years later, thank heavens. But at the time, nobody in the Reagan administration was predicting that this Cold War was going to end. And so we had this information, and we did nothing with it. And that was the great change, I think.
Thank you, Doug. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A, comments, your part. I just ask that you please identify yourself as you pose your question. Yes. And if you could wait for the microphone.
Ross Johnson at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Could I? There are a number of points, but maybe first just on the issue that Doug ended on, if you don't mind. You know, in a number of discussions over the years, the inattention to the information that Kuklinski had provided is sometimes explained by compartmentalization. A lot of people who logically would have known, who logically should have known, in state and elsewhere, didn't know. And I just wonder if you think that was a factor, or your case is persuasive. How, you know, we should have known, and how could we not have tried to do something about it? But was this issue of availability of the information perhaps part of the explanation?
Well, it's a hard one to call, but I can tell you that the senior officials were given a complete explanation. Here is this source, and we call it Rosebud, not quite, but did have a flowery name, and this is who he is, and that included the National Security Advisor and the President and the secretaries and the PDB receivers. Secondly, the people who were writing, we had a little problem because we tried to get some people read into it, and they said, well, if I can't use it in the Daily Nid, then I don't want to be cleared. Now, I was seized and thrown to the ground when I tried to strangle those two twerps, but So, and when you write the NID and you write other things, you can certainly incorporate into your, you don't have to describe it necessarily. And if you go back and look, for example, we got a report about a meeting, discussed martial law, and I've forgotten, I could look it up in here. You know, everybody there was, the report said everybody was in favor of it except Kanya, and, you know, so on and so forth. And the report that went out in the paper, in the intelligence report, said the fact that this was discussed suggests that some military people may be thinking about. So that's how so in a sense, no. The information was there to be used and to be communicated and to be incorporated into the analysis, even if it wasn't specifically quoted. And that excuse that I've heard is has something to do, I can give you a French term for it, but
Malcolm? Okay, questions over here? Okay.
Hi, I'm John Diamond, Wilson Center alum, and now over at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. If I'm not mistaken, the new Gaddis book makes this argument. I think other scholars have made the argument that the decision in Moscow not to invade was, in effect, the end of the Brezhnev doctrine, that it wasn't just a case-specific decision tailored to Poland, but that there'd been a major shift in thinking in Moscow that this kind of heavy-handed crackdown was no longer a workable option. And I wonder what the two panelists think of that argument, and whether there was any, especially Mr. McKechnie, whether there was any discussion at CIA at the time of whether the non-intervention had significance beyond Poland.
Why don't we take a couple more questions? A couple more over here. Any other questions at the moment? Okay. So, Wojtek Masny first, and then Ross Johnson for round two.
Yes, question on the same lines. You know, as Malcolm made clear, 1980, there is the weight of evidence in favor of the interpretation that the Soviets were ready to invade. By December 1981, the weight of evidence is in the opposite direction. Now, my question would be, as similar to the previous one, was there a particular point in time when a decision was made in favor of not intervening, or was it a cumulative effect of what was happening in Poland? Now, as far as the Brezhnev doctrine is concerned, the doctrine, that was a Western concept.
yes, I was going to say.
I mean, as far as the Soviets were concerned, they were weighing their options at any given time. So could we say that they were weighing their options sometime in 1980, perhaps in the aftermath of the Bydgoszcz events, yeah? And then they decided that they would not invade, but at the same time, in order to prod Yaroslavsky into action, they would give all they could, they would do all they could to give an impression that they were going to invade, so that he would act. Now, the interesting period is just before the martial law, when we have the evidence from Soviet archives that Malcolm cited, that under no circumstances we would invade, that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have evidence that the Soviets were increasingly uncertain about whether Yaroslavsky would really have the nerve to impose the martial law. So that period, just before the beginning of December, would seem to be a clear indication that by that time the Soviets themselves no longer have the nerve to invade as they would have been supposed to do according to the so-called Brezhnev doctrine.
Thank you. Ross Johnson.
Let's see, an analytic point and a methodological point. Where everybody was wrong was expecting some kind of Polish resistance under different scenarios. And I, as many others, have kind of gone back to this question, posed it to various people in Solidarity and elsewhere. Not that the Polish army would resist, but that Poland would resist. And the answer usually comes back, the church, above all, counseled non-violence and non-resistance. If that's true, that should have been knowable at the time and should have affected our thinking. I mean, I didn't realize that, and I should have. The methodological point, and to Malcolm, and I suppose the Anoshkin diary is a good case in point. We all struggle with these things. It's a question of how you interpret memcons, basically. If you and I have a conversation and we each write it up, the write-ups are probably not going to be identical. We don't have the Yaroslavsky notes from the same time. We have the Yaroslavsky justification later, but we don't have the... So how do, this is the methodological question of how one deals with one-sided accounts of a bilateral conversation.
Thank you. Doug, go first.
Okay, let me see. The issue of the Brezhnev Doctrine, I think I was going to say, that was our term, that was our label, which was used after the Czechoslovakia invasion, which was a bona fide invasion. Airplanes, tanks, overwhelming force, complete alliance. By comparison, even in 1980, I don't think, other than if we go back and actually look at the record, other than seeing there were some who wanted to talk about the issue, even that memo, the Suslov Committee was in August of 1980, had a force that was smaller than the Polish army. There was outsiders, okay? Now that, I think there was a guy who used to work for General MacArthur who said something about this is not a recipe for success. Mm-hmm. And that's not a recipe for success for an invasion. I think the overwhelming body of evidence will show that it was going to be a joint military suppression that was being, but in which the Polish army would at a minimum appear to be collaborating, not resisting, not openly attacking. Over time, things happen, and countries, if you study, you look at all the sociology in the Soviet Union as early as 1981, you got a lot of families who are saying, "Why are my kids being down there being killed?" And this is, and whose stupid idea was this? Comrade Andropov and Comrade Ustinov? Because if you'll check, the Afghan operation was a little cabal of the very same guys who are now trying to contemplate this problem. So their anxiousness to do it, to appear to do anything other than provide military, comradely assistance or something like this, fraternal assistance, I think was the term, that was eroding more and more over time. And yes, the concerns about Yaroslavsky, but as my recollection also, that some of the documents we have show that there was at least a discussion. Should we keep this guy or get rid of him? If he doesn't have the nerve, do we need somebody else? But again, as I said, I think you're going to have a hard time finding anything that says an outright invasion, and when the Polish army is not going to take part of it at all, then well, and another example I give, and this is one that really, as you recall, I think it was September, when they announced that they would extend the tour of active duty for and back in writing the war game and saying what would they have to do if they were going to impose martial law. One thing is don't bring a brand new bunch of recruits in, but out in the street with the same people are going to be shooting shortly after they get in. They did it when that happened. To me, that was the one that was just the fact that we didn't recognize that as being a symbol that at a minimum it's really on the table. The Vatican, well, there's a question of who had more sources in the Vatican. Did we have more sources or did they? And I don't know, as I said, the fact that they were still agonizing over how to do this and then were given a terrific opportunity and took it says a lot, I think.
Thank you. Malcolm, you've got the final word.
Okay. Have a half hour? Is that right? It's about what I need. I'll try to be very precise and more or less in order. For your question, I tend to go back to Doug's depiction of the Russians themselves as not knowing what they really were planning to do, much less, putting it under the rubric of a doctrine of some kind. I once interviewed Georgy Kornienko in Moscow, who was Gromyko's deputy for a long time, and his answer to the question of what the Soviets would have done was, in effect, we didn't want to even get to that point where we had to decide. We simply didn't want to think about that option if the time came. And that makes perfect sense to me, that it's a horrible decision, you just postpone it until you can't anymore. I guess on Wojtek's question of when a decision might have been made, that's partly an answer to that, I think. I don't think they had ever really decided. But there were other things going on and other factors to consider that make me think that they were always hedging against it. That may seem obvious. Of course, they didn't want to do it, but that they were going to probably decide against it much earlier than December '81, it seems to me. It seems to me that there was always this notion that we were not going to go in, other than what I said before about very early in the crisis where Gromyko says we can't possibly lose Poland. That seems just like a statement of, for the record almost, or just of conviction. He grew up, since World War II, his thinking had been, we can't possibly lose it. But when push came to shove, that would have been a different matter. Other factors include the aging of the Soviet leadership and the increasing cautiousness that they showed, the fact that they were already in Afghanistan. You might ask the counterfactual question, if Poland had come before Afghanistan, would they have thought differently? There was also the problem of no alternative leadership in Poland. There was no Polish Biliak, as they said. They tried. They pushed hardliners, but they found them wanting in every case. And I think particularly they came as close to an overt decision as I would conjecture, probably in July after the Extraordinary Congress, where, much to their chagrin, something like 90% of the delegates were fresh-faced participants in the system, precisely because the Poles had changed the rules around and ruined everything from the Soviet point of view. Yaroslavsky and Kanya survived. They also survived the previous sending of the June 5th letter and the uproar that was supposed to cause within the leadership. And I think at that point they decided, these guys are who we're stuck with, and there's no alternative for us. The question about Polish resistance, I'm not sure if I understood you right, but I would say that there was never any real question in people's minds that the Polish population would resist. There was always a distinction between the leadership and the military, but the man on the street, that was what everybody, it seems to me, was afraid. They were afraid that the ordinary person would in fact resist and there would be a bloodbath. The question of the church's role, when the church councils no, I would only say that after martial law came down, the church spoke out very forcefully in trying to encourage people not to fight, not to resist. And yet a lot of people did, and a lot of people died in Wujek and the Piast mines and in other places. So the church's word was important, but not necessarily determining for a lot of people. So I don't know whether you could really go by you could predict anything based on what they counseled. How to deal with one-sided accounts is what we're all trying to do in a lot of issues. I think one thing that helps to factor in is the degree of specificity of that account. And this account of Anoshkin's is pretty specific. I mean, that's a very colorful phrase. It clearly stuck with him. and he wrote it down. That's my interpretation. Another factor that I would consider would be what you might call the spontaneity of it. I would tend to give more credence to something like this that was written down either right at the time or shortly thereafter than to a set of minutes from a Politburo meeting, for example. I'm also reminded of the difficulty in interpreting one particular moment in the Czech crisis of '68, where Dubček, and we have KGB transcript of the conversation of Dubček and Brezhnev, and at one point Dubček essentially throws up his arms and says, look, go ahead, invade. You're going to do what you have to do, and there's nothing I can do about it. Well, there have been some interpretations among Russian historians more recently that, this was an invitation to invade. It really wasn't an invasion then. It was at Dubček's request. Here it is. There are the minutes, the transcript right there. Well, so even with a recorded transcript, you can't, assume that one version is correct over another. And I just want to make one last point about the question of invasion, and that when we're trying to determine what this all meant and what Yaroslavsky wanted and what the Russians were up to, the question is important: what use was the invasion meant to fulfill? If it's an invasion to help Yaroslavsky crush the opposition, that's one thing. If it's an invasion meant to oust Yaroslavsky because they're sick of him, that's something very different. It's just one of the smaller and smaller issues that loom larger and larger as you get into the details.
Thank you very much. Let me conclude the formal part of this session by again congratulating Andrzej and Malcolm for this major accomplishment. Thank our two panelists for inspiring, stimulating presentations. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I'd like to invite you for over a glass of wine and a bite of cheese to continue the conversation more informally right outside the conference room. Thank you. See you again soon.
Probably do. Yeah.
Well,
it's interesting. I was his PDP briefer beginning in October of '81. I was in the car with him a day or two afterward, because he got his briefing in the car, Hague. And because I used to meet him in his house, our car, and then I'd get out and we'd sit in the back seat. And one advantage, we both smoked cigarettes. So here's your PDB briefing, Mr. Secretary. And he said he was looking at the Washington Post, quoting Richard Pearl, and saying this was a failure of intelligence gathering and so on and so forth. And Hague slams the damn thing down, and we got to his office. We went up there. He went over the phone, called the Public Affairs, and said, I want to put a message out, not senior administration official, the rules, right? On background, not for attribution. This was not for attribution. We had lots of information about what they were planning and preparing to do. We just never believed they'd do it. And in fact, years later, when I read caveats, they said the same thing. And it was the way it was in this town. That's the way it goes through crisis after crisis after crisis. The Shah will make it. How do you know? Well, he'll turn first.
It's interesting because Valentine's Day Blizzard it sort of suggests that well, if you say they're going to do it, at least it gives policymakers a chance to loudly protest ahead of it. Then I suppose what you end up doing is you're predicting all kinds of things.
You didn't have to predict it, actually. Unfortunately, that's right. The meeting that took place on Sunday morning everybody said, they're going to do it. And of course, they were all recovering from having said recovery for 2 years earlier. And it's always a sort of overcompensation. But the point is, they're thinking about it, they're getting ready to do it. They have a decision to go either way. Why don't you, again, a good example, the invasion of Afghanistan. Jesus Christ, we finally got out of the wall. Meeting this Saturday. 14th is when I went home. I signed a memo of conscious pilots in Washington. And then there was a meeting downtown. I got a call Saturday, you got to come in Monday, Brzezinski's break. We still argued for 2 days until the 19th of December. We finally see they moved the fuel tanks into the border. Well, now we get.
No, it was an assumption that published.
Not on the, went down on the 20th.
And yet,
Public statement.
we can't
22nd.
Members of public
Press
society
spokesman
would say
Kremlin
they
says,
would resist.
oh, this is all a fabrication.
The way they felt then, we should have never known that.
We got
We
pictures.
should have made that assumption.
And of course, later, I read all these documents and realized they weren't lying to us, they were lying to
No, that's true.
Oh, the planes were down there, everybody was down there.
Let me just interrupt. Thank you for doing that. I'd love to talk to you about a different matter at some point. But it's soon now.
Over the wine, you mean, or?
I think that just your unread.
Vermont Evans, we could reach out. Your office is.
Yeah.
Well, I'm, I'll tell you what, I'm between 14 and 15.
You have
Between K and L.
3 months later.
Unfortunately, I'll be out tomorrow.
I mean, that's the other part. There's,
Thanks again.
I know you want to get up.
I have no feelings about this thing, as you can tell.
Yeah, right, yeah. I'm a former journalist. I'm a resident center.
Thanks for joining us. Good to see us again.